I've been with the LRB for nearly 2 decades, long enough that I sometimes meet people who are surprised to discover when they hear my accent that I'm not British, that in fact I'm American. A voice inside me reacts impatiently to the mistake, as if my Americanness were self-evident. But I've come to realize that my association with the LRB may reflect something about my own relationship to America, a distance, if not an estrangement. I live in New York, but I worked in the LRB's London office from 2007 to 2011. And like most American expatriates, I was running away from something. That something was personal, not the political persecution or racism that led many writers to settle in Europe in the 40s and 50s. But I was also fleeing the provincial, claustrophobic culture of American journalism in which I'd marinated for more than a decade. The claustrophobia was particularly oppressive when it came to the subjects that I wanted to write about, notably America's entanglements in the Middle East and its relationship to Israel. I'd found a sanctuary of sorts at The Nation, a leftist magazine, but whenever I wrote for a more mainstream publication, I had to prepare myself for a lecture from my editors. America's intentions in the Middle East were fundamentally, and elsewhere in the world, were fundamentally good. Israel was a democracy, however flawed, and criticism had to be responsible, as I was instructed by an editor who was now, suitably enough, a staff writer at the Atlantic Monthly. I preferred to be truthful, even if it meant being irresponsible. And so, in a kind of reverse pilgrimage, I found a greater freedom to speak my mind in the old world. Not that I left America exactly. You can't leave a country that looms so large in the world's imagination, whose government and military leave footprints in so many remote places. Whether you like it or not, you're part of what James Baldwin called the extraordinary drama which is America. But what is America? The very word Baldwin wrote in 1959, remains a new, almost completely undefined, and extremely controversial proper noun. No one in the world seems to know exactly what it describes, not even we motley millions who call ourselves Americans. Is it a dream or a nightmare? Democratic paradise or bastion of white supremacy and religious intolerance? Is it an actual geographic territory or a phantasmagorical hyperreality in Baudrillard's sense of something that is more real than real, a hall of mirrors in which the line between the world and our representations of it dissolves, or perhaps all the above? The rich confusion of American identity, in Baldwin's words, has given rise to endless attempts at definition by foreign observers as well as Americans themselves. Serge Danet, a French film critic who loved America's cinema as much as he despised its imperialism, called it the place that makes it possible to dream, but also the corner of reality that dreams crash into. Octavio Paz, evoking the country's immense scale, described America as geography, pure space, open to human action. In the words of the filmmaker Jean-Pierre Melville, America is the sublime and the abominable. Critics of American racism, class inequality, and foreign policy have tended to focus on the abominable. Frantz Fanon characterized the United States as a monster in which the sickness and inhumanity of Europe have grown to appalling dimensions. George Kennan, the least sentimental of American diplomats, echoed Fanon, describing America as a prehistoric monster with a brain the size of a pin. Yet even Fanon, who regarded America as a country of lynchers, turned to it for inspiration, drawing on the work of Black writers like Richard Wright and Chester Himes. America is a battlefield, Simone de Beauvoir wrote, and you can only become passionate about the battle it is waging with itself, in which the stakes are beyond measure. Since Beauvoir made this observation in 1947, at the beginning of the Cold War, there has been one battle after another, both inside America and over the idea of America and its role in the world. Currently led, if that is the word, by an infantile would-be king while the future is being forged in Shanghai and Beijing, America may no longer be a serious country. It may even be a laughable one. Yet, as the Swedish diplomatic historian Anders Steffansson writes in his new book, American Imperatives, the alarming fact is that everyone on this earth has an enormous stake in how the United States chooses to be and to act in this world. Not just enormous, existential. Consider, for example, the recent termination of USAID programs, which is expected to result in as many as 14 million deaths by 2030, or the kidnapping of foreign leaders in countries with large oil reserves. Donald Trump's presidency is many things, but it is, above all, a violent attempt to resolve the rich confusion that surrounds the word America, to make it synonymous with his vision of a fortress state at war with immigrants, shadowy globalists, narco-terrorists, and domestic enemies. During his first term, some influential commentators on the left argued that Trump was little more than a pro-business Republican, even if he lacked the impulse control, the deference to civilized norms of behavior exhibited by traditional conservatives. The argument was unpersuasive in 2016. Today, it's an evasion of reality. To be sure, Trump's efforts to downsize the administrative state, to eliminate regulations regarding workplace safety, consumer protection, and the environment are in sync with much conservative thinking. But the pardoning of insurrectionists and other criminals, the undermining of birthright citizenship, the attacks on Somalis as garbage, the aspersions cast on the competence and honor of black members of the military, the mainstreaming of neo-Nazis, the calls for the execution of political opponents, the shakedowns of law firms and universities, the war on scientific research and historical knowledge, and the expansion of a vast police state to hunt down and deport migrants, and increasingly to prevent critics of American policy from entering the United States, this is something else. So is the administration's warning against civilizational erasure in Europe in language that could have been plucked from the online manifesto that the white supremacist Anders von Breivik published the night before he went on a killing spree in Norway. For women seeking an abortion, for migrants and trans people seeking merely to exist, America has become quite literally a dangerous place. Some may protest that Trump's actual policies are hardly unprecedented. Democrats, too, have imposed crackdowns at the border and supported preemptive wars. Both parties have been complicit in the creation of the imperial presidency and of a neoliberal economic order. All of this is true, and the era of ICE, CCOT, and DOGE should not make us nostalgic for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, Obama's infatuation with drones, or the carte blanche that Joe Biden gave to Benjamin Netanyahu in Gaza. Yet anyone who cares about the stability of the republic might have reason to regret the disintegration of moderate republicanism, one of the defining structural features of American political life, alongside the spread of evangelical Christianity. George W. Bush led the United States into its most catastrophic war since Vietnam, yet he never expressed any hostility to Muslims. On the contrary, Nixon, a brooding, often monstrous leader who spied on his fellow Americans and presided over murderous bombing campaigns in Vietnam and Cambodia, made significant contributions to environmental protection and to the welfare state, which are being dismantled, at least in part, only now. Trump's movement, which captured the Republican Party as a radical acceleration of all the darkest tendencies in American political culture. It seeks nothing less than to dismantle what remains of the country's already diminished democracy and to establish in its place a predatory regime answerable to a single leader and his entourage. Whether the regime is fascist, post-fascist, or neo-authoritarian, what is indisputable, I think, is that it has unleashed what John Gans has called a sense of moral anarchy, in which there are no longer any limits to the expression of sadism and hatred or to their implementation as policy. Children forcibly separated from their parents, migrants from Venezuela flown to a concentration camp in El Salvador where they are tortured and sexually abused, the murder of Rob Reiner, an eminent Hollywood director, and his wife by their mentally ill son, cavalierly explained away by the president as a product of the director's hatred of him. The murder of Renee Nicole Good in Minneapolis by federal agents, justified by the same president as a response to domestic terrorism. To quote a line from one of Trump's recent speeches, no one can believe what's going on. As for all the talk of American greatness being restored, one is reminded of what Frederick Douglass, a former slave, said on the 4th of July, 1852, of the Declaration of Independence. It was nothing more than a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. At the moment, Trump appears to be on a roll. The attacks on boats in the Caribbean and the Pacific, the abduction of Nicolas Maduro, and the threats against Iran, Cuba, Mexico, and Greenland constitute a blunt reassertion of imperial dominance. But they also suggest a desire for diversion from domestic failure, recalling the gladiatorial futility that Antonio Gramsci contrasted with America's authentic innovations in his essay on Americanism and Fordism. Inflation is running at 2.7%, and the Republican Party's midterm prospects aren't promising. MAGA is bedeviled by divisions over Israel, Venezuela, and the use of force abroad. According to the political commentator Ezra Klein, the vibe shift in Trump's favor has already passed. But we are only a year in. Even if Trump fails, he can still inflict enormous, possibly irreparable damage. The United States looks more and more like the sick man of the Americas, a country of spectacular disparities in wealth, crippling political dysfunction, and pervasive violence. How did we get here? A variety of explanations, some of which overlap, have been advanced. The revolt of the non-college educated against the college educated, anger among whites in the heartland at coastal elites and their woke ethos, the politics of fear that emerged in the crucible of 9/11 and the war on terror, populist rage over immigration, an anachronistic constitutional order that has given far too much power to small states. All these accounts have a grain of truth, but none captures the full dimensions of America's crisis, which is not merely political, but spiritual, the latest chapter in an older struggle over what sort of country it wants to be, if indeed still is a single country. Two of the most powerful recent books about America's crisis, both works of history, trace the country's current impasse to the ideologies of infinite progress and freedom, the myths that provided American exceptionalism with its most enduring pillars. In Greg Grandin's ambitious historical essay, The End of the Myth, the regime of militarized, racist policing on the US-Mexico border appears as the all but inevitable heir of the now vanished frontier that had long functioned as a safety valve for America's class inequality. Grandin quotes a letter that Claire Booth Luce sent in the 1940s to her husband Henry, the publisher of Time, in which she wrote that with the end of territorial expansion, America could survive as a nation only by preserving its racial and cultural homogeneity with strict barriers against further immigrations of brown, black, and yellow peoples. The first barrier on the US-Mexico border, Grandin notes, was constructed with materials recycled from the barbed wire that surrounded the camps where Japanese Americans were interned during the Second World War. I'll let you absorb that. In Freedom's Dominion, Jefferson Cowie tells the story of Barber County in Alabama from the 18th century to the present, and in granular detail shows that the very idea of freedom has gone hand in hand for many white Americans with the right to lord it over others, especially black people and Native Americans, but also the victims of America's foreign adventures. Freedom, as most Americans understand it, is the problem, not the solution, a blinding ideology that stands in the way of a more democratic, egalitarian politics. In Cowie and Grandin's books, and in the New York Times 1619 project about the legacy of white supremacy, America's violence, cruelty, and obsession with racial purity are depicted as more or less baked in, an ineradicable part of the country's DNA. From the perspective of these more pessimistic currents in American historiography, tomorrow is yesterday, and every document of American civilization is a document of barbarism. The pioneer spirit, the belief in plucky individual initiative, the religion of freedom itself, all were written in blood. Has the American dream always been a lie? Is it simply red meat for MAGA? It's tempting to think so. The weight of the historical forces that so frequently darken what Ornette Coleman called the skies of America can easily turn into bitter alienation. In The Fire Next Time, published in 1963, Baldwin summoned the exhortatory cadences of the preacher he'd been as a teenager. By coming together for the sake of achieving our country, he argued, politically conscious blacks and whites could save not only America, but the world itself. When he published No Name in the Street in 1972, a book haunted by the murders of Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King, Baldwin had lost all hope in white Americans, the, quote, sickest and certainly the most dangerous people of any color to be found in the world today. Baldwin's anger was understandable. The backlash was in full swing, led by Nixon in the name of the silent majority. But America's traditions of resistance in politics and culture shouldn't be underestimated. Abolitionists, suffragists, civil rights, labor, and anti-war activists, advocates of women's and gay liberation, jazz artists, abstract expressionist painters, beat poets, all deeply American in their way. So were many of the communists who in the 1930s declared that communism was 20th century Americanism. As Eric Foner has emphasized, America's radicals developed a distinctive language of freedom, as far as possible from the freedom to dominate others espoused by Andrew Jackson, George Wallace, and Donald Trump. These traditions were always embattled, yet they have not vanished, and they have been enriched and reinvented by successive waves of immigration. A third-generation American born in 1972, I am in my own modest way an heir to some of these traditions. My great-grandparents were part of the wave of Eastern European Jews fleeing the pogroms in the early 20th century. America, as Philip Roth wrote of his ancestors, was their Zion, not Palestine. They revered FDR and despised Joe McCarthy and his chief counsel, Roy Cohn, Donald Trump's future mentor. They were grateful for America, but their gratitude was tinged with anxiety. My paternal great-grandfather, a socialist carpenter born in Minsk in 1892, was deeply shaken by the massacre at Kent State University in Ohio in May 1970, when the National Guard killed 4 students protesting the Vietnam War. As an adolescent, he had seen workers being shot by Tsarist troops during the 1905 uprising, and he could not believe it was happening in his adoptive country. My parents' understanding of America was less innocent. Having reached political maturity in the era of civil rights in Vietnam, they were all too familiar with the gap between American ideals and American realities. Yet they too, for many years, believed that the arc of history ultimately bent towards justice in America. As early as my teens, I found this narrative hard to reconcile with what I was learning about America's policies abroad, particularly in Latin America and Central America, South Africa, and the Middle East. I found it hard to reconcile with what I already knew about the history of slavery, segregation, and racial discrimination in America, thanks to the writings of James Baldwin, the autobiography of Malcolm X, and above all, thanks to the music that had obsessed me since I was an adolescent, the music known, for better or for worse, as jazz. Yet somewhat paradoxically, it was jazz in particular and black music more generally that prevented me, and still prevents me, from giving up on America. My guides to the meaning of American democracy and to what Albert Murray called the mulatto textures of American culture weren't the founding fathers. They were Duke Ellington, Charlie Parker, Thelonious Monk, Billie Holiday, John Coltrane, Sonny Rollins, Charles Mingus, Miles Davis, Ornette Coleman, and Cecil Taylor. Their music embodied the promise of another country, true to its professed ideals. Its very existence seemed to be a miracle. Europe's classical composers had drawn on vernacular music, but in America, a vernacular music created by the descendants of slaves had evolved into the country's greatest art form. It was a new song W.E.B. Du Bois wrote of black music in his 1935 study of America's still unfinished revolution, Black Reconstruction. And its deep and plaintive beauty, he continued, its great cadences and wild appeal wailed, throbbed, and thundered on the world's ears with a message seldom voiced by man. They sneered at it, those white Southerners who heard it and never understood. They raped and defiled it, those white Northerners who listened without ears. Yet it lived and grew, and it sits today at the right hand of God as America's one real gift to beauty, as slavery's one redemption, distilled from the dross of its dung. Distilled from the dross of its dung. Since slavery, Du Bois argued, black people had wrested the sublime from the abominable. Yet rather than repress the horror, jazz musicians placed the struggles of black America and therefore the question of American democracy at the center of their work. Throughout his career, Ellington composed tone poems about black American life. Sonny Rollins dressed up as a cowboy on the cover of his 1957 album Way Out West in a mischievous appropriation of the frontier legend, and a year later released the first civil rights album, The Freedom Suite. The bassist and composer Charles Mingus introduced his 1964 piece Meditations on Integration by warning that while segregationists didn't have ovens and gas faucets yet, they did have electrical fences. His piece, he said, was a prayer that we can find some wire cutters and get out. Mingus didn't have to look far. Jazz itself provided a superb pair of wire cutters. Few art forms have proved as supple, as welcoming of foreign influence as jazz. I'm thinking of Mingus's embrace of mariachi band music, Ellington's Far East Suite, Coltrane's exploration of Carnatic traditions, and Miles Davis's fascination with Spanish folk music. I am thinking of the violinist Billy Bang, swinging with Vietnamese musicians in a work reflecting on his experiences as a tunnel rat during the war. Jazz, the most American of musical languages, has been the most open to the world, the most hostile to walls of any kind. This sensibility, this wire-cutting cosmopolitanism is under assault today, but it has deep roots in American culture. You cannot spill a drop of American blood without spilling the blood of the whole world, Herman Melville wrote in his autobiographical novel, Redburn, published 12 years before the outbreak of the Civil War that would end slavery. We are not a narrow tribe of men. Our blood is as the flood of the Amazon, made up of 100 noble currents all pouring into one. We are not a nation as much as a world. Writing 6 decades later in the Atlantic Monthly, the social critic Randolph Bourne elaborated on Melville's reflections, describing America as not a nationality, but a transnationality, a weaving back and forth with the other lands of many threads and all sizes and colors. Any attempt which attempts to thwart this weaving or to dye the fabric any one color or disentangle the threads of the strands is false to this cosmopolitan vision. Nothing threatened this federation of cultures so much as war and what Bourne called the sewage of the war spirit. Liberal intellectuals who still seem to believe in a peculiar kind of democratic and antiseptic war, he warned, should understand that willing war means willing all the evils that are organically bound up with it. Bourne lost his battle. When Woodrow Wilson took America into the First World War, most of Bourne's peers were infected with the war spirit. The United States emerged from the Second World War, an existential battle against barbarism, if ever there was one, as the world's most powerful country and would soon evolve into a national security state, never not at war somewhere. 2 years after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Just as the Cold War and the anti-communist purges began, Simone de Beauvoir published a travelogue, America, Day by Day, one of the most acute studies of the American character since Tocqueville's Democracy in America. Beauvoir felt at first a dizzying attraction for America where the memory of the pioneers is still recent and palpable. She appreciated the whiskey and the hamburgers, the spirit of energy expansion and conquest embodied in New York skyscrapers, and the ready warmth of the people, as disconcerting as it was to an intellectual from Paris. She loved the jazz she heard in clubs in New York and Chicago, music of mourning, sensuality, eroticism, joy, sadness, revolt, hope. Black music always expressed something. Jazz spoke to her of experiences beyond what she called the propaganda of the smile. The propaganda was ubiquitous in Cold War America, and Beauvoir reported on it with alarm. She described America as a coercively cheerful country that refused to confront the reality of death, that expressed its horror of the body in advertisements for deodorant and laxatives. Most Americans, she found, were incapable of nuance, since to accept nuance is to accept ambiguity of judgment, argument, and hesitation. They preferred to believe in a geometric world where every right angle is set against another, like their buildings and their streets. The arrogance of Americans, she wrote, is not their will to power, it's their will to impose good. And she added, to fight evil. Intellectuals told her that ideas detrimental to democracy should be suppressed, and spoke with resignation, even fatalism, about the inevitability of war with the Soviet Union. For all of America's vaunted freedoms, the people she met were strikingly conformist, voicing an optimism about their country that not even the sight of Buchenwald could shake. America's rugged individualism had left them atomized, incapable of imagining themselves as a potential collective with the power to alter their circumstances. America, Beauvoir feared, was at risk of becoming no different from the totalitarian regimes it claims to oppose, a place where equality and freedom had been emptied of their meaning. The only way to continue loving America, she decided, was to love it sorrowfully. C.L.R. James, the great Trinidadian radical and Pan-African activist, a child of the British Empire and one of its fiercest critics, loved America with stubborn defiance and would likely have taken American citizenship if he hadn't been deported in 1952 as a foreign subversive. James had settled in the United States in 1938 after the publication of The Black Jacobins, his classic history of the Haitian Revolution. He wrote, worked as a Trotskyist organizer, and married a white American woman, Constance Webb, who gave birth to their son, Nabi, in 1949. A West Indian Marxist, James had no illusions about the condition of Black Americans or workers, yet he developed an intense admiration for America's democratic traditions and its popular culture. The essential conflict in America, he wrote in his 1950 study, American Civilization, lay in the chasm between America's ideals and the brutal realities of class and race oppression. These contradictions generated an unbearable tension at the heart of American life, which expressed itself in the subservience of the intellectuals, a longing for a man of force, resolution, will, power to command, and therefore threat of dictatorship. The greatest power in Western civilization, he feared, no longer knows what to believe about itself. On June 10, 1952, James fell victim to that confusion when he was arrested by agents from the Immigration and Naturalization Services under the anti-communist McCarran-Walter Act and incarcerated at Ellis Island. Under surveillance since his arrival 14 years earlier, James was treated no differently from the Stalinists he despised. Much to his fury, he was forced to share a cell with a group of communist activists who, knowing that he was a Trotskyist, took a vote on whether to speak to him. They voted yes, on the grounds that his status as a fellow prisoner mattered more. Over the next several months, while awaiting his deportation, James threw all his energy into a manuscript that he would publish the following year under the title Mariners, Renegades, and Castaways, the story of Herman Melville and the world we live in. He dedicated the book to his son, who will be 21 years old in 1970, by which time I hope he and his generation will have left behind them all the problems of nationality. The miracle of Herman Melville, James argued, was that he painted a picture of the world in which we live, not just in America. In Moby Dick, Melville envisioned an industrial civilization on fire, plunging blindly into darkness, a world of massed bombers, of cities in flames. James, who wrote his monograph in part to secure his release, does not mention the word socialism, but there's no mystery as to where his sympathies lie in his account of the struggle on board the Pequod between the destructive, tyrannical Captain Ahab and his multiracial working-class crew, with their grace and wit and humor and their good-hearted contempt for those for whom life consists of nothing but fine linens and tea on the piazza. In between Ahab and the crew, weighing his options with Hamlet-like indecisiveness, is Ishmael, whose intellectualism leaves him isolated from the masses, unable to embrace reality spontaneously. The story of Ishmael, a completely modern intellectual, James suggests, is the story of the liberals and Democrats who during the last quarter of a century have led the capitulation to the totalitarians in country after country. Mariners, Renegades, and Castaways concludes with an extraordinary reflection on James's confinement in Ellis Island, the much hallowed center for processing immigrants that since the 1930s had served as a detention center for undesirable aliens and political dissidents. James distrusted his communist cellmates, but when his ulcer went untreated, they leapt to his defense, inflicting a moral defeat on the U.S. Department of Justice, even with all its officers and armed guards, its bolts and bars, its thick walls, and its power. While the Department of Justice sought the extermination of the alien as a malignant pest, the aliens remained steadfast, citizens of the world who knew it better than many world-famous correspondents. In James's description, Ellis Island comes to resemble Melville's Pequod, a miniature of all the nations of the world and all the sections of society. As citizens of the world, James and his fellow castaways were also, he underscored, potential American citizens who, like others forced to struggle for their rights in the land of the free, understood them better than most Americans. When the district director of immigration and naturalization of the Port of New York tells James that he can always return to Trinidad and drink his papaya juice, James asks his reader, the average American citizen, to consider the fact that the law provides that the alien should have a hearing, that even if the decision is unfavorable, there is a right of appeal, and that if the appeal is rejected, the matter can be taken to the district court, and indeed all the way up to the Supreme Court. This theory of the law, he writes, could have originated only in a country where the traditional role of the immigrant and the tradition of civil liberties are such as to have created for the alien every possible opportunity to make as good a case for himself as possible. Can that be reconciled with the brutal and arrogant statement, if he does not like what is happening to him, he can go and drink papaya juice? You cannot reverse the whole historical past and traditions of a people by packaged legislation and loud propaganda. To try to carry them out by grafting them onto a traditional democratic system, and the result is complete chaos. Chaos or community? Where do we go from here? Is the title of Martin Luther King Jr.'s last book, published in 1967. That year, King came out against the Vietnam War in an impassioned speech at Riverside Church in Manhattan. Just as James emphasized that American injustice was communism's greatest recruiting tool, so King, in his last book, wrote that nothing provides the communists with a better climate for expansion and infiltration than the continued alliance of our nation with racism and exploitation throughout the world. The burning of human beings with napalm in Vietnam struck him as a symptom of a far deeper malady than a passing political crisis. That malady ultimately lay in the disregard for life that characterized the United States, a country based on socialism for the rich and individualism for the poor. Racism and segregation, a subtle reduction of life by means of deprivation, whose ultimate logic is genocide, had generated a schizophrenic personality on the question of race. There was the self that proudly professed the great principles of democracy, and a self in which she sadly practiced the antithesis of democracy. White backlash was nothing new, merely the resurfacing of old prejudices, hostilities, and ambivalences that have always been there. The same search for rationalizations, the same lack of commitment that have characterized white Americans on the subject of race. When, King wondered, would poor, underprivileged whites, whose egos were fed by white supremacy, while their stomachs went hungry, realize that they had much more to gain by forging an alliance with poor black people? Like James, however, King was less concerned about poor whites than about what he called the protectors of the status quo and its fraternities of the indifferent who are notorious for sleeping through revolutions at a time when our very survival depends on our ability to stay awake. At the end of his life, King was moving towards the view, echoed by Bourne, James, and Baldwin, that America's domestic agonies, its internal chaos, could not be disentangled from the pursuit of America's economic and political interests abroad. Cold War competition with the Soviet Union had accelerated the dismantling of apartheid in America. Since the United States could scarcely project itself as the land of the free abroad while depriving black citizens of their rights, no matter how many jazz musicians it sent abroad as ambassadors of American freedom. But with the passage of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts of 1964 and 65, the civil rights movement found itself at an impasse. The United States was for the first time in its history a democracy for all its citizens, and black Americans were now equal on paper to whites. But freedom often meant being free to live in substandard housing or to fight in Vietnam, where the funds for Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty were being siphoned off. As King understood, the needs of the national security state and American multinationals were eating away at the project of giving substance to the promise of freedom. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death, he wrote. America, the richest and most powerful nation in the world, can well lead the way in this revolution of values. There is nothing except a tragic death wish to prevent us from reordering our priorities so that the pursuit of peace will take precedence over the pursuit of war. When King was assassinated in Memphis a year later, he was a lonely figure, abandoned by many of his erstwhile allies for his opposition to the war in Vietnam. They told him in paternalistic tones to stick to what he knew, namely civil rights, and to leave foreign affairs to the experts. Some accused him of giving ammunition to the Russians. Never mind that King's anti-imperialism had an impeccably American pedigree. In 1821, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, the son of a founding father, warned that if the United States went abroad in search of monsters to destroy, flashing the murky radiance of dominion and power, the fundamental maxims of her policy would insensibly change from liberty to force. She might become the dictatress of the world. She would no longer be the ruler of her own spirit. Today, the warnings of King and Quincy Adams could hardly seem more prophetic. American democracy has been progressively hollowed out by forever wars, deindustrialization, the tyranny of wealth, and the creation of an archipelago of maximum security prisons where the poor can be confined if they haven't already succumbed to death from addiction or despair. Today, the United States is neither the freest country in the world, as Noam Chomsky has often described it, nor a particularly stable one. It would be foolish to deny the force and allure of Donald Trump's perverse charisma, but after the violent humiliation of 9/11, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the financial crisis of 2008, Trump walked through an open door. His supporters were on their knees, ready to hand over the reins of power and many of their freedoms to a man of force and resolution, a man who hated the system that had betrayed them as much as they did. Even so, the speed with which the system caved to Trump 2.0 has been shocking. During the blitzkrieg of executive orders, Democrats in Congress looked paralyzed and impotent. 86 crossed party lines to join the Republican majority in the House in condemning the horrors of socialism, even as the administration was gutting the social safety network. Major American research universities, including my alma mater, Columbia University, have collaborated with the administration in its efforts to round up and deport foreign students for their opposition to Israel's war on Gaza, drawing on a highly tendentious definition of anti-Semitism that has underwritten both genocide and genocide denial. Billionaire trustees have scrambled to kiss the ring. Seen from Europe, where I spent most of last year, America's intellectual and moral defenses against the Trump juggernaut appeared to be unraveling. Pining for the rules-based order on which Trump turned his back, the foreign policy establishment seemed incapable of pronouncing the word Gaza, much less genocide, as if Biden's support for Israel's war hadn't done much to erode the order's legitimacy, as if America and the world could be saved by a return to the safe shores of Cold War Atlanticism. Parts of the far left fell prey to a different form of Trump derangement syndrome, refusing to confront Trumpism except as a secondary symptom of neoliberal crisis, or doting on Luigi Mangione as a resistance hero. If the ballot couldn't save America, perhaps the bullet could. School massacres seemed as ever to be more common than demonstrations against Trump's policies. Everywhere I went, people would ask me, why aren't Americans resisting? I would usually respond by saying, but they are, you just don't see it because it's taking place in the courts. But I wasn't satisfied with my response, not just because the Supreme Court would invariably strike down the decisions of the lower courts, but because I felt like one of Beauvoir's realist intellectuals who plead helplessly that they cannot effect change on their own, who were all too quick to defer to the fraternities of the indifferent. I knew that Paris's streets would be flooded with protesters if Macron's agenda were half as destructive as Trump's, and let's not even talk about the streets of Tehran and other cities in Iran. We Americans seem to be sleepwalking through the counter-revolution. Explaining the mysteries of America to people abroad, I felt oddly like the writers I'd met in Arab and Muslim countries, to whom the United States government had relentlessly preached and who were constantly forced to respond to questions about the supposed peculiarities of their political culture, the widening gulf between educated elites and the masses, the influence of religious fundamentalism and conspiratorial thinking, the susceptibility to authoritarianism, the spasms of senseless violence, the attraction of military solutions to social problems. How different really were we? At least the people whom America had lectured had the alibi of not having elected their dictators. This is not who we are, Biden reassured us. But it is at least partly, and the rest of the world sees this all too clearly. No country, however, is impervious to the reactionary wave, as many prosperous American expatriates are now discovering, having found a sanctuary from Trump's America in European countries where the far right is now poised to take power. America's convulsions are part of a global transformation brought about by neoliberalism, the loss of a socialist horizon, and a pervasive sense of malaise and driftlessness, a world in decomposition, as the Lebanese novelist Amin Maalouf describes it in his book, The Shipwreck of Civilizations. For the first time in history, Maalouf writes, we have the means to rid the species of all the plagues that assail it, and here we are, however, launched at full speed in the opposite direction. The precariousness of life under contemporary capitalism and the return of scarcity have been a gift to authoritarian politicians who would rather fan anti-immigrant hysteria and bigotry than face problems that demand collective solutions, such as global inequality and the climate crisis. America may be an outlier for now in denying the existence of climate change, but European countries too have been outsourcing the control of refugee flows to Libya and Turkey, hoarding resources, turning themselves into fortresses. Some observers, such as Mark Mazauer, have argued that European societies with memories of the Second World War have stronger guardrails against the temptations of neo-fascism. But it's not clear how strong the guardrails are. Why try to detoxify yourself, as the far-right Rassemblement National has done in France, now that Trump has succeeded by becoming the very devil he was accused of being, as Marine Le Pen's father, Jean-Marie, pointed out? The Trump tornado has changed the world in just a few weeks, Viktor Orban declared. Yesterday we were heretics, today we're mainstream. You might expect that America's leadership of the far-right international would have sparked a paroxysm of anti-American sentiment among radicals and progressives, yet it has not, strangely. Schadenfreude may partly explain this, as a swaggering and unspeakably tacky casino on a hill has taken the place of a smug city on a hill. The American empire has undergone a great overdue humbling. Exceptionalism, it turns out, does not exempt you from history or from decline. For many people outside the West, who've long known what lies behind America's benevolent sermons, its self-conception as the end of history, seeing the mask stripped off feels like a vindication. At least, they say, Trump is not a hypocrite. At least he admits he's invading Venezuela for its oil and not to promote democracy. At least he can impose a ceasefire, quote-unquote ceasefire, in Gaza. As the Nigerian historian Rahman Idrissa reminds us in a probing essay in Equator, State Mania, foreigners have always been drawn to the U.S. as much for its sheer power, the sense of boundless strength it projected, as for its democracy, the defects of which are hardly unknown to people outside America. There's also an awareness abroad that while America is the avant-garde of reaction, as garish as the gold-colored fixtures in the Lincoln bathroom renovation, it has plenty of company, and that Washington is not unique in its malevolence, even if its power to do harm is unequaled. In his liner notes to John Coltrane's 1963 album Live at Birdland, Amiri Baraka remarked that one of the most baffling things about America is that despite its essentially vile profile, so much beauty continues to exist there. I used to think this was a perceptive observation. Today, it strikes me as an example of American provincialism. People outside America aren't baffled by the contradiction, which is true of most of the world's societies, and they're as likely to associate America with Coltrane, Kendrick Lamar, and Beyonce as they are with Trump, Vance, Hegseth, and Stephen Miller. Like Beauvoir and C.L.R. James, they know that another country exists in America, as is immediately evident when you step into a bookshop in Paris, Berlin, or Madrid, stocked with translations of Baldwin, Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, David Graeber, and other messengers from an alternative American future. We are, of course, very far from that future in the States, where Trump, Rubio, and company seem bent on returning to 19th century gunboat diplomacy, invoking the threat of narco-terrorism to justify acts of aggression and sheer plunder, an inspiration, it should be noted, to other states with imperialist designs on their neighbors. New York City, where I live, is currently the home of the imprisoned leader of Venezuela and his wife, hostages of a regime that makes no secret of its intention to loot the country's oil. But New York is also the center of one of the more promising developments in American life, the resurgence of an egalitarian left, moving from protest to politics. Shortly before I left for Berlin a year ago, the Indian filmmaker Mira Nair and her husband, the political scientist Mahmoud Mamdani, told me that their son Zohran, a New York State Assembly member in Queens, was running for mayor. He's either an idiot or he's insane, I thought. At the beginning of his campaign, Mamdani, a 34-year-old Muslim socialist born in Uganda, was an unknown with 1% support in the polls. Now he is mayor of New York after a brilliant campaign conducted in large part by young volunteers, many of them veterans of the movement to end Israel's war on Gaza. With his singular charisma, his nimble use of social media, and above all, his emphasis on affordability, Mamdani assembled a broad coalition of recent immigrants, middle-class progressives, and African Americans, and he defeated Andrew Cuomo, an establishment Democrat, not in spite of his critiques of Israel and real estate interests, the sacred causes of the local Democratic establishment and the New York Times, both of which tried to torpedo his campaign, but in part because of them. As Frank Rich observed, support for Palestine was Mamdani's not-so-secret sauce, particularly among younger voters who see Palestine not simply as a foreign policy issue, but as a domestic one, since the repression of pro-Palestinian demonstrations has lent itself to a wider assault on freedom of assembly, academic and intellectual freedom, and immigrant rights. Like our most distinguished working-class warrior, Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, who presided over Mamdani's inauguration earlier this month, and like Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the leader of the Squad in the House, Mamdani and his team understand that a new politics can succeed only if it offers a vision of economic equality to the crew, and that our own Captain Ahab impersonator, for all that he attempts to instill fear in his opponents, is a coward. In his victory speech, Mamdani insisted that New York would always be a city of immigrants and alluded to the American socialist leader Eugene Debs and to Nehru, interweaving his adoptive country's radical traditions with the anti-colonial politics he inherited from his parents. It was a syncretic idiom in the American grain of a kind practiced by our jazz musicians. Not long after his victory, Mamdani appeared on stage with Mahmoud Khalil, one of the leaders of the Palestine protests at Columbia, a green card holder, recently released from prison, whom the Trump administration is still trying to deport, an heir like his classmate Mohsen Madawi of C.L.R. James and the castaways of Ellis Island. Among those sitting on Mamdani's inaugural committee were labor and community organizers, Muslims and leftist Jews, the novelists Colson Whitehead and Min Jin Lee, the legendary tenor saxophonist Sonny Rollins, and Sami Zaman, the owner of Mamdani's favorite kebab restaurant. New York is not America, and Mamdani's experiment is a precarious one. But for many Americans, I'd like to think, for the majority, the sea of faces at his inauguration represents America's future far more than the frenzied orgy of evangelical Herrenvolk democracy that was Charlie Kirk's funeral. I was in Algiers when Mamdani won. My Algerian friends who'd closely followed his rise were thrilled. Where else but in America could a left-wing, brown-skinned immigrant, a racialized other, become the mayor of a globally influential city? I guess they hadn't heard of Sadiq Khan. Algerians have long had a soft spot for the states. While the American government is resented for its support of Israel, America has the advantage of not being France, and Algerians remember JFK's 1957 speech in favor of Algerian independence and the pressure that he exerted as president to end French rule. The morning after Mamdani's victory, I spoke with the journalist Ihsan El Hadi, who had recently been released from prison after nearly 2 years behind bars, and whose children live in the States. We can always rely on America to bring us the best and the worst, he said of Mamdani's victory. Later that evening, after a discussion of my book on Fanon, several people came up to congratulate me on Mamdani's win. Suddenly I felt homesick, thrust back into the extraordinary drama of America evoked by Baldwin. And for a moment, I allowed myself to hope that another country might still prevail, that it could step back from its foreign wars and overcome its internal disarray. That was the country we saw on the steps of City Hall in New York on the 1st of January when Mamdani was inaugurated. 2 days later, Operation Absolute Resolve was launched, and then on the 7th of January, an ICE agent killed Renee Nicole Good with 2 shots to the chest and 1 to her forearm. I don't blame myself for letting hope in through the door. Who wouldn't? Without hope, we're lost. But hope can also nourish the consoling fantasy that things can be turned around in the next election cycle, even in a mayoral race. I suspect we Americans are particularly susceptible to this compulsive optimism, as Beauvoir characterized our collective fever dream, the innocence that remains the most enduring of American reflexes, the story we tell ourselves when it's too painful to look at ourselves. Since the 2016 election, and particularly over the last year, I've tried to love America with sorrow, as Beauvoir did. I've often reminded myself of the emancipatory potential of its founding ideals, like C.L.R. James. And I've returned frequently to the prophetic words of Baldwin and King. But what I mostly feel these days as I look at the disaster unfolding in America and its horrifying repercussions throughout the world is an intense sense of shame. Shame isn't a pleasant emotion, but any honest reckoning with what our country has become will have to start with it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adam. That was at least semi-hopeful. We have some roving mics, 2 on this level, 1 on the top level. It's almost impossible to see with the lights as they currently are. Could we dim them slightly for actually just spotting raised hands? I'm going to ask a question just while we try and work that out. What was conspicuous in your account of reasons for hope was an absence of art. It seemed like the art in your lecture was from when you were a child, was from work made in the 1960s. I wonder if jazz is a useful case study because of the way that, by some measures, it's become a sort of elitist art form. And I wonder where the sort of precocious 12-year-old Adam Shatz would find hope in the art of the present.
Well, I mean, it's true that jazz is no longer a music of the barricades, but I think that you can find an insurgent sensibility in contemporary popular forms of music. I mean, certainly. An album like To Pimp a Butterfly, Kendrick Lamar's record, and much of the work that he's done, you find it in. I think you can find it in contemporary visual art. I don't think that it's certainly not. It doesn't end with jazz. That just happens to be the work that has particularly moved me. But I think that there are still very strong insurgent and dissident artistic expressions in America today. I mean, I actually not only a few weeks ago I attended a pretty remarkable performance in Brooklyn by a guitarist and singer-songwriter who goes by the name of Stu. And it was a rather small performance. I don't think there were more than 200 people in the audience, but it was a brilliant satire on what America has become. So I think these currents are still there. So yeah, I didn't mean to suggest that it's only in jazz that you can find them.
Do we have any raised hands on this level or on the upstairs level yet? I don't think we do. Is one over there that you're walking towards? God, it's really hard to see. We have a roving mic moving in a direction, which I assume that means that is a question.
I mean, you even saw that in the overwhelming reaction to Paul Thomas Anderson's film, One Battle After Another, which was made before Trump's re-election, and includes these riveting scenes of ICE raids. I mean, the film is an adaptation of a rather freewheeling adaptation of a Thomas Pynchon novel. But when you see that film, you feel as if you were watching the news, and I think it stirred an immense reaction among Americans who are deeply troubled by what's going on in the States right now. And at least according to the polls, I mean, Trump is terribly unpopular.
The silhouette, who I can't see, I think has a mic.
Thank you so much. That was very, very moving. I want to ask you about the role of China, especially in relations to America and the United States. What do you think of this new Cold War narrative? And do you think there are prospects of cooperations in vital issues like climate change despite the cultural differences and political hostilities?
I mean, I would like to think so. I would certainly be in favor of that. I'm not sympathetic to the anti-China rhetoric, which seems to be, again, very much bipartisan. And as Adam Tooze argued in his LRB lecture in New York just a few months ago, China has been actually quite pioneering when it comes to environmental protection. Now, granted, China is also responsible for an immense amount of pollution, but they're doing far more than the United States is to pursue green policies. So is that going to happen? I mean, I don't see it at this point, but at the same time, Trump's Make America Great policies, it's been noted by numerous commentators, have largely had the effect of making China great again. And I mean, I think increasingly China is seen as a stable, purposeful power that is strong and determined and that appears to have its head on straight. And not surprisingly, a lot of countries, particularly in the global south, the developing world, are looking to China, not to the United States.
To pick up on that, and something that I can't remember who you're quoting, asking if America even is still a country. How do you follow that through? I
mean, America is it's a country, but it's not really a nation. I mean, it's never really been a nation per se. I think it is a country, but it's not a country in which you could really have a civil war, even if you wanted one, because there's blue and red in every single state. There's not really a clear geographical divide. I mean, granted, Middle America tends to be very pro-Trump, and the coastal cities are more anti-Trump. But I think that there is a kind of an intense sense of lived polarization. I mean, you really don't know. I mean, it's bizarre in a way. You don't really meet people on the other side. I'm in spaces where there are Trump supporters, but I don't actually know them, and they don't know me, and I think because of that, there's an incredible sense of distrust and suspicion, and you feel that. I mean, I teach at Bard College. And Bard is a little island of left liberal politics in an area that is pretty pro-Trump. And if you go to a supermarket there, you can almost identify who the Trump supporters and who the people from the college are, and you actually feel that tension and hostility on the campus.
There is, I mean, you don't necessarily engage with them on a conversational level, but we are all sort of living with this almost, well, I don't know if it's new or very old, projection of a kind of new nationhood by this body of people, which is the idea of the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah.
I wonder if the particular fantasy that currently occupies within, Stephen Miller's wife posting a picture of Greenland with an American flag in it. Yeah. This idea that essentially we've got the Don Road doctrine. That is a kind of imaginative projection as well. How does that sit with the projection of America that you've offered?
Well, obviously it's diametrically opposed, and unfortunately, it's a vision of America that has deep roots and has a real echo among, I would say, a sizable fraction of the American population. I don't think it's the majority, but I think it's and I would hesitate to put forward a number because I haven't done a survey. But there are a lot of Americans who feel dispossessed. They feel that the country somehow belongs to them, by ancestral right, and that it has been colonized and taken over by others who do not have the same rights to Americanness that they have, and they are, they're powerfully swayed by this nostalgic vision of of a white man's democracy, essentially. And unfortunately, I mean, a lot of white women support that vision as well. I mean, we saw that in Trump's, in the last election.
I think I see a hand raised in the middle here, and okay, we've got loads of hands now. So let's take questions two at a time. So there's two sort of level with where you are now on that side. So let's just take them in turn, two at a time.
Thank you, that was fascinating. I was thinking, in this clamour for hope that you were describing, a lot of people turn to Baldwin, or indeed Fanon. But I guess there is a concern, I think, amongst some readers of those writers, that in that clamour we sort of objectify them and objectify their politics and kind of talk about them in terms of hagiography. They become people that we tweet about and print on mugs and T-shirts. And I wondered how we turn to these writers in a way that does justice to the radicalness of their politics.
Okay, that's great. Can you, I think just behind you there was someone.
Totally hear this.
So it was a question about how the sort of radicalism of some of these artists has been, I guess, commodified in a form of, I guess, logos on T-shirts.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's totally representative of what you said, but there's a question behind as well.
So you mentioned the deportation of C.L.R. James, and obviously you could go back to the post-World War I Palmer raids for the first Red Scare. So I guess I wondered what you thought about the current proliferation of ICE in terms of how America treats immigration control, not just as dealing with people with insecure immigration status, but kind of as moral agents, because that kind of is what it feels like both the Red Scares are, and from the outside, kind of what this ICE thing is. It's not just about your immigration status, it's about trying to weed out kind of morally bad suspects within the American politics, and what that's doing, I guess, for America now.
Did you get that?
Something about the ICE raid.
Well, just ICE. Just talk about ICE.
I mean, ICE is our Gestapo right now. I mean, ICE was created. I believe ICE was created the same month that the United States went to war against Iraq. A war without any. I mean, it was a war of aggression. Iraq posed no threat whatsoever. Iraq was on its knees. Iraq had been destroyed by war and American sanctions, and of course had no involvement whatsoever in the September 11 attacks. One of the things that I wanted to suggest in this talk is that American foreign policy and American domestic policy are totally interlinked. You can't really separate them, to me, it seems that the creation of ICE, or the deployment of ICE today, rather, is a way of maintaining tensions at an extremely high level. It clearly serves a political purpose, and also serves to demarcate the boundary between Americans who supposedly have a right to be here, and undocumented people who have been essentially criminalized. We've gone from the war on terror to a war on immigrants and a war on quote-unquote narco-terror. America is always at war, whether beyond its boundaries or internally. And I think the domestic wars and the external wars have become increasingly fused. And it's interesting to look at Trump's justifications for the attack on Venezuela. Essentially, he is pursuing a kind of foreign policy inside the country against the undocumented, while projecting himself as a policeman in Venezuela and in other countries where he claims narco-terrorists have to be held to account. So these two things are very fused, I think.
And as for radical chic, I guess, I think it's worth raising the fact that the Baldwin centenary last year was a huge deal. It seemed like Baldwin's centenary was marked as much as Kafka's was, in a way. And I wonder, what's the status of that particular radicalism within the present culture? Why is Baldwin still, potentially occupying the greatest cultural status he has, despite the loss of a kind of radicalism?
Yeah, I mean, the Baldwin's current status is interesting because at the time that Baldwin died, he was in large part forgotten.
Yeah.
Baldwin's radicalism was actually underappreciated. In the late 1960s, he was the object of really brutal and homophobic attacks by militants in the Black Power movement. Above all, Eldridge Cleaver, who wrote scurrilously about James Baldwin in his book Soul on Ice. Baldwin was, of course, ahead of his time in so many regards, not just with respect to race suppression, but with respect to sexuality. And I think that that's another reason, an underappreciated reason, that Baldwin was rediscovered and revived, and of course it was really during the height of the Black Lives Matter protests that Baldwin was rediscovered, and obviously Raoul Peck's film played a role in that too. I think that the reason that Baldwin remains such an important point of reference is that he was a prophetic figure, and in that sense he was very much like Martin Luther King. I mean, he was not a believer at the end of the day. I mean, he left the church. I mean, he had been a preacher when he was 14 or 15 years old. He leaves the church, but the cadences of the church remain very much a part of his language, and so does that moral vision. And I think that's the reason that people turn to him. And of course, also he is the ultimate YouTubeable intellectual. I mean, Baldwin is never not worth quoting, and he was obviously incredibly magnetic and charming and funny. Yeah, exactly. He's a great performer.
I think we probably have time for 2 more questions. It'd be good if we had a non.
Holding.
Oh, you've got a mic. I was going to say a non-male question.
Adam, thanks so much. Just quickly, I'm really interested in this sublime and. Just been holding a microphone for. That's fine.
You haven't talked much about Barack Obama, and I wonder how you see those 8 years as a precursor of Trump, a creator of Trump.
Great disappointment.
Where does he fit in?
Okay, we'll take that question. Where was the disembodied question? I heard someone. Go on, finish your question. It's fine.
I'm just curious. The sublime and abomination, I find it really interesting, or Obama nation, I guess. Previous question. This relation between art and repression. Do you feel there can be art without this repression that you've presented here tonight? And if there can't be, is that the price for a society having this great art that you've presented? And is that a worthy price for individuals in a society to pay?
Okay, take Obama first.
Just to respond very briefly to the question about Obama, I think that there was much more hope than audacity, and I think it's. I feel sad when I think about Obama. Actually, it was a real missed opportunity, I think, especially when it came to the financial crisis. I mean, I think he was, in a way, too impressionable. I mean, he was very close to the Harvard boys, people like Larry Summers, and so I think that to some extent, yes. I don't want to blame Obama for the fact that we have Trump now, because, I mean, in some sense, Trump's emergence as a politician is, it's a response to the fact that we had a black president, and a black president who was, incredibly gifted and charming and brilliant, and who sent up Trump at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. I mean, just flayed him. And I think that that event, I think probably more than any, is what led Trump to enter politics.
Origin story. The Lion King.
Yeah, I mean, the obsession with birthright citizenship. I mean, absolutely. So I don't want to blame Obama for it, but I do think that Obama was part of a line of Democratic politicians who helped to pave the way for this reactionary populism that plagues us today.
And as for the idea that the dichotomy is necessary for the kind of art that you're celebrating in the lecture, the idea that you almost need a sort of exchange of repression and resistance in order to generate the sort of the aesthetics that seem to be the subject.
But I think that's so often the case. I mean, if you look at the efflorescence of expressionist art in the Weimar period, or if you look at the experiments in visual art, music, and literature in the post-colonial world, there's often a relationship between artistic innovation and political crisis, and I don't think that America is unique in that regard. Whether you have to have one in order to have the other, I can't say.
We have time for one more question. There's a woman in the middle on that side, sort of halfway down. Just keep your hand up if you could. And okay, that wasn't the person I had in mind, but we'll do two then.
I just wanted to ask about, your I wouldn't say endorsement, but that's the only word I have in my head right now of Kendrick Lamar as like a kind of popular insurgent art form or media. And I kind of question whether there can be a popular insurgent art form because we saw in like his Super Bowl performance, someone came out with like a Sudan and Palestine flag and was dragged off the pitch immediately. But Kendrick didn't speak about this at all. So it's like, how much can we see them as radicals or just like participators in the institution, but from a different perspective that still allows it to kind of go on?
That's great, thank you. And then about three rows in front.
No, that's a good point, and I'll admit that I really haven't kept up with his work since To Pimp a Butterfly, and I'm sure you know much more about Kendrick Lamar than I do, and I think.
Okay, swing and a miss, Kendrick. Go on.
Hi, I'm interested in what you said about how you feel like you don't know Trump supporters. I come from Northern Ireland, so also the idea that you can't have a civil war when you're geographically mixed, I would kind of doubt. But also coming from a society that is quite segregated, I'm wondering, do you feel like that kind of lack of knowledge about the other side, was that there with the old Republican Party? And then I wonder, are you just observing that, or are you positioning it as a problem? Do you want to get to know the modern day Trump voter, and which kind of Trump voter do you want to know?
Yeah, no, I think it's a fair point, and probably I should. I'm not saying that I'm particularly eager to.
You'll have to spend a bit more time in America to do that. Of course, something that hasn't.
I mean, it's funny. Your comment is quite funny. It reminds me of Jefferson Cowie, the historian that I quoted earlier, who published that terrific book, Freedom's Dominion. He's someone I'm friendly with, and he sneeringly referred to me as we're friendly as the global citizen, and so I have to plead guilty.
I think we'll stop there. It occurs to me that we haven't mentioned the fact that this year is America's birthday, so maybe we should all reconvene the other end of that and see how the status of America feels. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much, Adam. This series will continue. We'll conclude in 2 weeks' time with a bit of a code switch. Seamus Perry on pluralism and the modern poet. Tickets still available. It'll be here 2 weeks' time. Please come. But for this evening, thank you so much, Adam Shatz.